To Proverbs 23 again. Proverbs 23. We're going to start there at verse 29. We're going to finish this chapter, move on to chapter 24, Lord willing, next Sunday. Proverbs 23, start at verse 29. We'll read to the end of the chapter. Who hath woe? Who hath sorrow? Who hath contentions? Who hath battle? Who hath wounds without cause? Who hath redness of eyes? They that tarry long at the wine, they that go to seek mixed wine. Look not thou upon the wine when it is red, when it giveth his color in the cup, when it moveth itself aright. At the last it biteth like a serpent, and stingeth like an adder. Thine eyes shall behold strange women, and thine heart shall utter perverse things. Yea, thou shalt be as he that lieth down in the midst of the sea, or as he that lieth upon the top of a mast. They have stricken me, shalt thou say, and I was not sick. They have beaten me, and I felt it not. When shall I awake? I will seek it yet again. This section is really one unit and deals with the same subject, that is drinking and drunkenness. Modern speech has sort of sanitized the language that we use to describe a drunkard. He's just a little bit tipsy. He's just feeling good. He's feeling no pain. He's excessively inebriated. He imbibed more than he should have. And we try to gloss over the fact that someone is drunk and not in control of their own wits by language. Hollywood, entertainment, have tried to glamorize the idea of the drunk, the town drunk. Otis the drunk on the Andy Griffith Show. Everybody loved Otis. He was funny. Hal Smith, the actor, I met him 15 years ago, and he was a nice fellow, but he was a great actor. And I got him to give me an autographed picture of himself in his old Otis getup. I've got an old picture of him autographed at home. But you watch that old show, and there's the episode where he was the town drunk in Mayberry. He'd come and he let himself into the jail. And he was afraid because his brother was coming to town to visit, and he knew his brother had become a great success back in his hometown, and he was ashamed of himself. And by the end of the episode, you find out that his brother is also the town drunk in his town. And everything cute and funny. And Dean Martin, and his idea that he's just stumbles through life drunk all day long, always under the influence. Of course, it's difficult for anybody to function, although some do, under the influence of alcohol almost all the time. I saw a guy yesterday, and I hadn't seen him in at least 10 years. And he had come to the place I was working at about 11, 12 years ago, and he wanted to apply for a job. He said, "Do they run drug screening tests?" I said, "Well, I'm sure they will." He said, "Because I smoke pot." And I said, "Well, what are you talking about? How often do you smoke it? Once, twice a month? No, every day." So he was confessing it to me. I said, "Well, maybe this wouldn't be the place for you to apply for a job." How the guy is still functioning in society, I have no idea. We have a guy that's here in our city council, here in our city. I'm not going to give his name, but anyone who lives here in town knows who he is. And he used to be the chief of the fire department here in town. Alcoholic. He functioned all day long, the chief of the fire department, under the influence of alcohol. He did this for years. And he was in a nearby town, and they caught him passed out, drunk, sitting behind the wheel of his car, and gave him a citation for it about 7, 8 years ago. Here's our #1 safety officer in our town, is a functioning alcoholic. I didn't feel very safe at that point. But they like to say, well, the town drunk, the drunkard, he's a good-natured, he has a good heart, and he's really harmless, and he doesn't mean to be in trouble. He just has his own problems. He lives his life and he wouldn't think of hurting anybody. That's how they're portrayed in the media and in movies and so forth. But real life is not that way. Proverbs 20 verse 1 said, "Wine is a mocker and strong drink is raging. Whosoever is deceived thereby is not wise." And this whole section here in chapter 23 is about that kind of deception, that kind of foolishness. The man who tarries long at the wine, verse 30 says, he learns certain lessons. And there are certain lessons to be learned from practical experience in the life of a drunkard. Number one, I'd say this: drunkards have more than their fair share of woe as they go through life. And it's called the woe-begone face. It's the look on their face, the broken blood vessels, the red nose, the puffy eyes, and so on, that's on their face, and they can't seem to shake it. They can't seem to get rid of it. Even if they stop drinking, it leaves a permanent mark on their appearance and their demeanor. Anybody who's worked in rescue missions trying to help people with this problem can spot it right away. Secondly, I'd say this: we learn that drunkards have more than their fair share of sorrows in life. Their drinking eventually affects their income, it affects their job, it affects their home, it affects their family, it affects their health, it affects their friends, their relatives who still love them. Everything that they hold dear and important suffer or are neglected, or they end up losing because of their habit. Thirdly, we learn in life that drunkards argue. It said in verse 29, "Who hath contentions?" Drunkards like to argue. They always have and they always will. They boast of being able to fight and take on anybody in the bar. And at that time, they are probably the least able to get into a fight with somebody because they're unsteady and so forth. Their coordination is bad. A guy says, comes into a bar and he says, "I can beat up any guy in all the state of Alabama, Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia combined." And one guy from Kentucky stands up and he knocks him down with one punch. The guy gets up, he brushes himself off and says, "I'm willing to admit I took in too much territory in my last statement." And they are contingent. They start arguments and argue about nothing, but they are looking for someone to argue with. We also can observe in life that drunkards babble. He says, "Who hath babblings?" Their speech is slurred. The things they say are incoherent. They don't make any sense. In their mind, it makes perfect sense. Dr. Ruckman had an interesting observation about some of this. And I've had to think about it. And I repeated it to some guys that I worked with once. And none of them were saved, but they thought, "You know what? Never thought about it before." Quite like that. And what he said was this: when people are under the influence of alcohol heavily, and the same thing is probably true with drugs, when they're under the influence of alcohol and they claim to be seeing strange things, strange shaped things, rather than just in a hallucination, he says, "I believe they're seeing things that are really there. It's just you're not supposed to be seeing them. When you're sane, when you're sober, when you're in control of your faculties, And I've had to think about that, and I can't discount it. You don't know. There seems to be, there's an unseen world that we don't know everything about. We certainly live and believe that there is as Christians. All the blessings we hope for, we haven't seen them yet, but we believe that they're just as real as you and I sitting here with each other now. And so, I believe they're seeing things that are really there. They babble, and they may be describing things that they see and nobody else in the room can see them. It's part of the price you pay when you abuse your health and when you abuse your mental coordination with alcohol and so on. Your nervous system is abused. There's a fifth lesson that can be learned by drunkenness and drunkards. Everybody should take notice of. And they have wounds without a cause, as verse 29 asks. Who hath wounds without cause? Drunkards stumble, they stagger into poles, they stagger into buildings, they stagger into parked cars, they stagger out into the traffic, they stumble off the curb, they stumble and trip into the gutter, they cut themselves with knives and broken bottles and glass, they cut themselves with razors, they fall off ladders, they fall off stairs, they fall out of boats, and some have fallen off of houses and buildings because of their drunkenness. And they get beaten up by cops, beaten up by people robbing them, beaten up by their own so-called friends that they're partying with. Verse 35 also says in our text, "They have stricken me, shalt thou say, and I was not sick. They have beaten me, and I felt it not. When shall I awake? I will seek it yet again." Verse 35 says when a drunkard is stricken or beaten and he's harmed, he doesn't feel it. We've all heard the stories of some guy who gets behind the wheel drunk and he causes an accident, injures somebody, sends him to the hospital, kills somebody in another car, and he comes through fine. Not a bone of him is broken. He seems to be completely in one piece afterwards, and you wonder how in the world these things happen, yet they do. Not verse 6, but point 6, let me say this, drunkards also have red and bloodshot eyes. That's evident in verse 29, the redness of eyes. You know, bear in mind, this was written 3,000 years ago. So the phenomenon of people seeking to get drunk and going after it, and they know what kind of effect it's going to produce, and they still go after it, that's nothing new. It's not a modern phenomenon of the 21st century, the 20th century, or the 19th century, the 18th century. This has been going on for 3,000 years. The Bible addresses mixed wine here in verse 30. Wine is a sufficient illustration to cover all of the effects of alcohol. The Bible doesn't spend all this time going through gin and bourbon and rum and whiskey and beer and brandy and schnapps, every other variation of alcohol. Vodka doesn't list all of those variations. Not necessary, because the same idea is behind each one, just as it is with mixed wine. Verse 31 says, "Look not thou upon the wine when it is red." The Bible's general rule seems to be total abstinence. Total abstinence, not what most people want to hear in the modern world. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul tells Timothy, "Drink no longer water, but use a little wine for thy stomach's sake and thine often infirmities." Every drunkard knows what that verse is. And he says, well, Paul says, go ahead and drink wine. No, he didn't. He's not saying, quit drinking water and start drinking wine all the time. He says, use a little wine. There is a medicinal benefit that can come from it in certain cases. Use a little wine for thy stomach's sake and thine often infirmities. But he doesn't say, hey, stop drinking water and just start drinking wine all the time. Don't interpret the Bible that way. But the Bible's general rule seems to be total abstinence. You know something? If you're not a smoker, then there's really no chance of you developing throat cancer, emphysema, like smokers develop. Mouth cancer. You might you're not protected from various forms of cancer, and some people have come down with certain types of lung cancer who never were smokers. But they weren't caused from cigarette smoking, so you really don't have that to worry about. If you're not a drinker, then there's never any chance of you driving drunk. And the Bible's rule seems to be total abstinence. Now, in the Leviticus chapter 23, once a year there was a feast at Jerusalem, the feast of the Passover, and they drank wine in that feast. But other than that, the life of the Jew seemed to be abstinence. He was on the wagon all the time. And those who would fall off the wagon in drunkenness were to be shamed in society. They weren't celebrated as the happy-go-lucky town drunk like modern world tries to depict them. But let me look at verse 31. It says, "Look not thou upon the wine when it is red, when it giveth his color in the cup, when it moveth itself aright." Now let me read that same verse in 2 or 3 other modern versions, so-called up-to-date versions. Here's the Revised Standard Version, Proverbs 23, verse 31. Do not look at the wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, when it goes down smoothly. See, they already assume you're going to be drinking it. They already presuppose you're going to drink it. Just be careful when you do. Here's the NIV, the non-inspired version. The NIV. Verse 31 says, do not gaze at wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, when it goes down smoothly. And here's the Living Bible. By the way, when someone calls their book the Living Bible, aren't they implying that my Bible's dead? I take exception to that. Living Bible, Proverbs 23, verse 31. Don't let the sparkle and the smooth taste of strong wine deceive you. See, they already presuppose, they already imagine you're going to be drinking it. We're not going to try to dissuade you or discourage you. They already assume you're going to be drinking it. That's not necessarily God's recommendation for the Christian, for the one who would follow after God. The Bible says that qualifications of the pastor, the bishop, the deacon must be sober, not given to wine, and so on. Let me move on here. In the inn, wine becomes a bites and stings. He says, it biteth like a serpent and stingeth like an adder, in verse 32. A black adder, an African adder, is one of the most venomous, poisonous snakes in the world. And that's why we read, whosoever is deceived thereby is not wise, back in chapter 20, verse 1. Look real quickly, I'll show you an interesting verse in Isaiah 65. Keep your finger here. We come forward to Isaiah 65. Notice there verse 8. Isaiah 65 and verse 8. Thus saith the Lord, as the new wine is found in the cluster, and one saith, destroy it not, for a blessing is in it, so will I do for my servants' sake, that I may not destroy them all. New wine, he says, is found in the cluster. That is, in the cluster of the grapes is where the new wine will be found. That is, in essence, juice from the grape. And when the Bible says new wine, he's talking about freshly squeezed juice from the grape. But Solomon admonishes in Proverbs 23, verse 30, those that have woe and contentions and babblings and sorrows and so forth are those that go to seek mixed wine. Somebody's diluted, someone's added brewer's yeast to it, somebody's fermented it, somebody's doctored it up to create the effects that alcohol will produce. It'll ferment all by itself if you're not careful, if you leave it on its own. We had a jug of fruit juice, a fruit punch in the church refrigerator years ago, and it'd be several months before we had another fellowship or some sort of thing, and next thing you know, we opened it. That thing was as smelly as hooch at the local winery here in Rancho Cucamonga. And so I don't know who was responsible for that, but we had to toss it out, dump it. And it's like, there's all kinds of jokes about, the evangelist, he's having a church baptismal, and I take that, no, he's having a church revival, and the town drunk. He comes up to confess. He dumped all of his liquor down at the local river, and he came to confess and tell everybody about it. And so everyone praised the Lord, and then they closed with a hymn, Shall We Gather at the River? Right? And there's all kinds of jokes about drinking and drunkenness, and everybody thinks it's cute and funny, but the truth is it's very serious. And more lives have been ruined, more lives have been destroyed by the abuse of alcohol, the abuse of liquor of any kind, that people ought to be mindful of it. But new wine is found in the cluster. That's why in Acts chapter 2, on the day of Pentecost, it says, others said, mocking, these men are filled with new wine. That is, they were mocking the disciples, saying, those followers of Jesus, they can't hold their grape juice. And they were mocking them. So, New wine is one thing. Mixed wine, or wine as is generally understood, is another thing. And you can put underneath that every other variation or form of alcohol that are made and concocted deliberately to produce a delusional effect on the drinker. And notice there, verse 33, "Thine eyes shall behold strange women, and thine heart shall utter perverse things." The inner thought life of the drinker is always sensual. He's always thinking about fornication, lasciviousness, uncleanness, nudity, perversion of some kind, voyeurism, whatever thing is contrary to normal decency between two members of the opposite sex married. Whatever is contrary to that, liquor will get him there faster than anything else. Men figured out long ago they got to break down women's inhibitions, get them to stop saying no and get them to say okay. And the way they get the cut to the chase, the shortcut to that end, is to get them, a little bit drunk. So they're feeling fine. They're feeling like they're in control when they're really not. And if that doesn't work now, they take to putting sleeping pills in their drinks. That's what they call it, Rohypnol. What these drugs are that you hear about in the news. And the girl wakes up not knowing where she's been or who she was with or what exactly happened to her. And there's perversion of every kind. And alcohol, liquor, tends to lead in that direction. There's no other way to describe it. Think about a society that in which everybody was drunk all the time. You know what you'd have? You'd have Native American Indians in Albuquerque, New Mexico, about 20 years ago, 25 years ago. You go there, and there's just drunken Indians laying all over town. On the sidewalk, on the hood of a car, doing nothing, producing nothing, no ambition in life. They just live to be drunk all the time, living on reservation land that's free of any property taxes or federal income taxes, and no ambition in life. That's why now we're going to rescue ourselves and save ourselves from the terrible effects of drunkenness and alcohol. What are you going to do? Oh, we're going to switch over to gambling. You just exchange one bad habit for another. And nothing good is going to come of any culture or subculture financing themselves or directing themselves with vice, whether it be everyone's dad was drunk and no ambition in life, or everybody's losing their money through gambling. And don't you know, just like the mob and organized crime secretly runs all the casinos in Vegas, don't you know that organized crime is going to run the Indian casinos wherever the government allows them to be built? Some unscrupulous men are going to want their money, and they don't mind breaking a few bones or breaking a few people's legs to get it out of you. That is no way to organize a society. Think of an entire society that was like that. How do you succeed? That's why I say that the Bible's general rules seem to be abstain from it at all costs. Now, the man who's soused, the man who's drunk, the man who's inebriated, the man who's under the influence is like two things here in verse 34. First of all, he's like a drowning man in the middle of the ocean. It says, as he that lieth down in the midst of the sea. And secondly, he's like a swaying man up in the crow's nest on a ship. He's swaying back and forth, and everything he sees around him is moving in an unsteady way. And the drunk knows that he's tipsy. He knows everything's out of distortion. And so he knows how it is when he's staggering. He's trying to stand upright. He's trying to walk straight. That's why the police have to test the guy to walk this straight line to see if you can manage it or not, and judge whether he's under the influence or not. And the guy who knows he's under the influence of alcohol, he's got to go from one place to another. He gets behind the wheel of his car, and he's trying to compensate for the way the world looks to him, so he's extra careful, 2 hands on the wheel, and he doesn't go very fast, 30, 35 miles an hour. He may weave, and he may give the wrong indicators, wrong signals on the road, but he's trying to compensate for the fact that the whole world is spinning around as he's trying to proceed. And it's a terrible thing. And notice verse 35, the one that's addicted to alcohol can't stop it. He says, they've beaten me and I felt it not. When shall I awake? I will seek it yet again. Some people never learn. They never learn that they're destroying themselves, they're ruining their own lives, they are jeopardizing the safety of other people, they're a disgrace and embarrassment to their families, to their children. I have a friend I graduated from high school with, and he was 18, 19. He talked about how much he liked certain kinds of beer and wine, and he started to drink like he thought every grown-up guy was supposed to learn to drink. And he got engaged to a young woman, and they were heading on the 10 freeway, and he was under the influence after had been somewhere drinking, and there was a car parked on the side of the freeway, stalled. Somebody had left it there, and he hit that parked car and killed his fiancée in the process. And the court took into account that he had no trouble with the law before that. He had a good college record. He had never had any alcohol-related mishaps prior to that, and he was involved in a number of things. He was engaged to this girl. He certainly didn't intend this kind of harm. And they reduced all of his charges down to misdemeanors. But now he's got to live with the fact that he killed someone's daughter, the girl that he was planning to marry. And yet I know this fellow well enough to know he didn't learn from that. He's the kind of guy who probably went back saying, you know, I got to be more careful next time I drink. Instead of giving it all up completely, he's the kind that says, when shall I awake? I'll seek it yet again. I'm going to go to the next party, but I promise I'll be more careful the next time. That's the problem with, like, Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. You know, Dad, they don't say total abstinence is what we advise. People should not drink. They're not brave enough to go that far. They say, well, when you drink, you should be careful. You know, make sure you have a designated sober driver and all that nonsense. Well, that's just hypocrisy. Either get on or get off. Don't just say, well, you know, we want to accommodate both sides of the argument. Both sides of the argument aren't right. One side's right, the other side's wrong. Let me close with a few other things. Besides famous people who were famous for being drinkers, you know, Babe Ruth, the great pitcher and outfielder for the New York Yankees, world home run record holder for the longest time. Babe Ruth was a drunk. He was drunk from drinking beer. And the beer companies came to him and wanted him to promote their products because they knew he was a big drinker. And Babe Ruth had character, though. And he said, I've signed too many young fans' baseballs to then let my image be associated with something that would harm them. And he wouldn't do it. They don't have, we don't have athletes with character like that. Remember Dennis Rodman, that freak that played for the Lakers for a while? He's not with the Lakers. He's still a freak. He used to complain, I'm nobody's role model. I don't want people looking up to me as a role model. I want to live my life, do what I want, party when I want, party how I want, with who I want, as often as I want, and I don't want to have to worry about what kids think of me. Talk about two completely different kinds of character of professional athletes. But besides glamorizing people that were big drinkers, there have been a number of great men of accomplishment who swore off liquor altogether. They believed that it was foolish to engage in it or to indulge in it. John C. Calhoun was a very famous American statesman in the early 1800s. Was what we call a teetotaler. The strongest drink he would drink would be tea. Nothing more than that. S.S. Kresge S.S. Kresge, whose last name was the K in Kmart, and J.C. Penney, both saved men, both multimillionaire chain store merchants. Both would swear off liquor altogether. J.C. Penney had a growing fortune back in the early 1920s. In 1929, the stock market crashed, and he lost most of his fortune, and he had to cash in his own private insurance policies just to make his payroll of his employees. But his health went down, and before they called them rehabilitation hospital, they used to call them sanitariums. And he went to a place to regain his health, a sanitarium, and in there he heard, I forget the name of the hymn. He heard one great hymn being played during one of the chapel services they had, and his own father had been a Baptist preacher, but he was never saved. And so he got saved based upon that song. Everything he had been taught as a kid came back to him about how important God was. And J.C. Penney gave his heart to Christ, became a born-again believer in a sanitarium, and then spent the rest of his life building up his fortune and giving to charitable groups, especially orphans of missionaries and preachers whose families had nowhere else to turn after Dad was dead. Andrew Carnegie, great millionaire from the steel industry, swore off liquor altogether. Henry Ford, the multi-millionaire automobile manufacturer. A man named Van Cliburn, classical pianist, was a teetotaler. Roy Rogers, our famous American cowboy, Western movie star cowboy, swore off liquor altogether. A very famous English poet named John Milton was a teetotaler. Albert Einstein swore off liquor and alcohol altogether. David Livingstone, famous explorer and missionary, the 1800s to Africa, gave up liquor altogether. Billy Graham, still alive, world-renowned evangelist, has sworn off liquor in every form. John Adams, our second U.S. president, was, at least it was publicly known, at least, that he would not drink any alcohol. Philip Marshall Montgomery, a very great military genius of Britain, was a teetotaler. Robert E. Lee, the Southern general, said, "My experience through life has convinced me that abstinence from spirituous liquors is the best safeguard to morals and health." And American President Taft once said, "He who drinks is deliberately disqualifying himself from any further advancement. You're sabotaging your own future by drunkenness." President Teddy Roosevelt said the alcohol business, quote, "tends to lawlessness on the part of those who conduct it and to criminality on the part of those who patronize it." Billy Sunday almost single-handedly brought about the enactment of Prohibition in the 1920s by the way he preached. He was a former baseball player in the National League, got saved, and became an evangelist, used the fame he had established as a baseball player to help attract the crowds, and one of the most lively preachers and evangelists that this country ever produced. And he preached hard against liquor, he preached hard against drunkenness, and he was on a one-man crusade to rescue towns and cities and communities all around this country from the evils of alcohol and drunkenness. And he almost single-handedly brought about the demand for prohibition, that there be a national law outlawing the sale of liquor. And it became something that was established from county to county to county throughout the country. And there are still a lot of counties in this country that are considered dry, a dry county where they do not allow the sale of alcohol. But those are shrinking, fewer and fewer across the country. I doubt many are in California that way. But down in the South and places, you'll still find counties that are dry, where the county will not allow the sale of liquor. Of course, all that did was open up the door for illegal liquor, moonshine and so forth. People make it on their own and sell it illegally. Let me close with this story. It's kind of a sad story. In Bradenton, Florida, was a drunken man who was slightly drunk. He'd had about 3 beers, or slightly under the influence. And he hit a boy on a bicycle and killed the boy. In a panic, it says the man fled the scene of the accident in a dented car. Police found the body, blocked off the area, began a yard-to-yard search. They found a dented car in a driveway, and upon entering the house, found a trembling, sweating man about 40 years old, hiding in the attic, drinking from a fifth of whiskey. They questioned him and charged him with manslaughter and leaving the scene of an accident. Later, all charges were dropped because this poor moderate drinker, a social drinker, had struck and killed his own 12-year-old son, who had been riding home from school on his bike. Well, the man killed, a true story, the man killed his own son while driving under the influence. That's like I say, if you resolve in your heart, I will not give in, I will not go down that road, you'll never have to worry about driving drunk, being under the influence, not being in control of your speech, not being in control of your coordination, not saying things you'll later regret, not having contention, not having woe, not battling, not injuring yourself inadvertently or causing harm to somebody else. I mean, all the benefits certainly outweigh the negatives when it comes to abstaining. But the guy like in the proverb, verse 35, when I awake, I don't feel too good now. I got a headache, I got a hangover, but we're going to have another party next week. I'll seek it yet again. A man's a fool. The person was a fool in the proverb. And Solomon is warning against that. Just as Solomon warned against foolishness, and by trying to compare it to a strange woman, an unclean, a harlot woman, in order to direct his son's attention on to a woman of virtue and wisdom, try to lay out this contrast, he's trying to paint as negative a picture of drunkenness as he can. And it's amazing how many elements of that haven't changed in 3,000 years. In fact, men have just found new ways to get drunk. The wine doesn't do it enough for me, I'll find something else to do it for me. And Romans chapter 12, verse 3 says, For I say unto every one of you for I say unto every man that is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, according as God hath dealt to every man the measure of faith. Now, the opposite of sober used to be drunk. It still is, but in today's world, the opposite of being sober is also to be high. It's funny how the King James Bible keeps up when language changes and definitions of word changes. You don't have to change the Bible. And he says not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly. And someone who goes through life thinking they can party, they can just get under the influence, they're not thinking soberly. They're not sober-minded. They're not approaching life seriously. And I find it very profound. And I'm glad God gave us a Bible. These others are just ridiculous. They assume you're going to drink.